Bienvenidos otra vez. This is Professor Tatum with yet another lecture for History 1301. We got a kind of tough one today, guys, so hold on tight. We're getting toward the end here, and we're just going to start looking at what I consider to be a second American Revolution, which is the U.S. Civil War. And in this lecture, we'll be looking at the causes and motivations of the Civil War. We'll start out by looking at a little context as usual. Then we'll examine the causes of the Civil War, then motivations for people to get involved in this mayhem that this war would turn out to be. And we'll also look at the role of African Americans in the Civil War and recognize their agency. So many historians consider the Civil War to be a second American Revolution. One of my mentors, for example, would frequently argue that it commonly gets underplayed how revolutionary the Civil War was, as well as how much of the American Revolutionary War was a civil war. And this is not just something that historians have decided out of nowhere. People in this time period write about the war itself and the time period surrounding it and the things that followed it in that type of way. They write about it as a revolutionary moment in time. And these are individuals both in the North and in the South who seem to have viewed this Civil War and the time surrounding it as a very revolutionary moment in time. Remember, when we're talking about a revolution, we can be referring to a multitude of things. It can be maybe overthrow of a government system, replacing it with another, or it can simply be a complete change in the way of thinking about something or approaching something. What we're looking for in general, though, is just a sudden, radical, or complete change. And that is absolutely something we'll see come as a result of the American Civil War. We need to remember getting into here. First wave of Southern states had left the Union after Lincoln was elected, and they formed the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy, to band together in resistance to the United States. And they quickly started occupying government buildings in the South, including military bases. But one base they had not gotten was Fort Sumter. Pretty difficult for them to take over this because it was surrounded by water. And basically, as a demonstration of his lack of recognition of the Confederacy's sovereignty, Lincoln sent the military to come in and resupply this fort here in South Carolina, Fort Sumter, with basic supplies, things like food. And this is his way of acknowledging that he did not recognize this as Confederate territory. He saw that this was territory that was still under his jurisdiction as commander in chief of the United States military. The Confederacy certainly did perceive this as a threat. And before these supplies could even make it to the fort, they went ahead and fired on this base. And these were the first shots of the American Civil War, right? From here, boom, the war was waging. After this attack on Fort Sumter, several other Southern states realized that there was no turning back from here, and they wanted to choose either one side or the other, and they decided to jump ship along with these other states who had already left the Union, and they went ahead and left the Union as well and joined the Confederacy. So by 1861, 11 Southern states had left the United States, claimed that they were part of this other nation, this Confederate nation, and they engaged in 4 years of a bloody, and I mean bloody, civil war with the U.S. Army. And I want us to understand what would be the cause of this, what kind of fed into all of this. I've always wanted to say that history is much more complex than it frequently receives credit for, right? You'll hear me say things like, there's not just point A and point B, just black and white. There's a nuanced nature to all of this that should be acknowledged for what it is, all right? And there are certainly several causes that come into play when we look at the Civil War, but I'm going to argue that there is one key cause that seems to kind of unite them all, right? All these different causes we look at seem to be based around a central issue. Let's take a look at some of the major causes that get proposed as key causes of the Civil War and see where we perhaps see a common thread. So one cause that's frequently thrown out there is that the Civil War was all about states' rights. And I will certainly not argue against that. That was certainly a key component here. There were unresolved disputes over where the line was drawn in this federalist system between where states had power and where the federal government had power. And several of these southern states who tended to have a history of promoting states having more power than the federal government had come to feel that the federal government was overstepping their power and that they were becoming perhaps tyrannical in a sense by becoming so powerful. But what was it that the federal government was doing that these states were so concerned with that they wanted to limit? Well, what the federal government was doing, that had all these southern states up in arms, was that they were limiting the expansion of slavery, right? They were starting to place clear definitions on where slavery could and could not exist. And that had a lot of these southern states fearful of what that might mean for them, all right? We need to understand that a lot of these southern states who left the Union were heavily, heavily dependent on slavery for economic reasons, for socio-political reasons. Slavery was the foundation or the cornerstone, as we'll see one individual argue, to the Southern way of life. Please remember, though, while the South certainly did become very dependent on slavery and created a society based around slavery, that does not mean that they needed slavery. No human being or no society ever needs to enslave human beings. That is not a necessity by any means. So, pretty clearly, the states' rights they're concerned with here are states' rights to have slavery. So, if somebody's ever telling you, trying to convince you that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, okay, we need to sit there and think states' rights to what? Pretty clearly, states' rights to have slavery. Tariffs, another cause that's commonly attributed to the Civil War. We need to understand that the South suffered far more economically from tariffs than the North did. Remember, tariffs, by the way, are taxes on goods coming into the nation. But the reason that the South felt the impact of these more is because, as we've seen during Jackson's presidency, when the U.S. would place high tariffs on European nations, those European nations would frequently retaliate with counter tariffs, and they'd start placing taxes on U.S. goods that were going into Europe. And the South depended very heavily on partnership with European nations because they were exporting all kinds of cash crop like cotton and rice off to European nations. And so when they're having to send things like cotton off to European nations who are placing counter tariffs on the U.S., that's going to hurt those southern states economically. But we got to consider, where are these cash crops coming from? What is producing these cash crops? Well, I do want us to understand that the number of people in the South who used slave labor was actually a lot smaller than we might imagine. Slavery was pretty concentrated, meaning that there was a few individuals who had the majority of enslaved people working for them. But the most influential, the most profitable plantations growing cash crops like cotton had the largest numbers of enslaved people throughout Southern society, right? And they were depending very, very heavily on slave labor to produce those cash crops that they were selling abroad. So even when it comes to making economic arguments, saying that these tariffs are hurting the South, the products that they're so concerned with are based on this system of slavery as well. Another cause we can consider when looking at the Civil War, it is somewhat based on efforts to preserve the Union. So preserving the Union was a key goal of President Abraham Lincoln throughout the Civil War, early on especially. We do need to remember, though, that Lincoln had some pretty complicated views on slavery. He personally found slavery immoral, but his main political stance on slavery was to just limit the expansion of slavery. He wasn't so interested in going after it where it existed at this point. We'll see how and why that changes throughout the Civil War. Early in the war, his biggest goal, though, as I suggested, was preserving the Union. And he made this very clear. He spelled it out word for word. His paramount objective in the struggle, meaning the Civil War, was to save the Union. And it was neither to save or to destroy slavery. He stated, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some, leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. Very clearly, he's more invested in keeping the country together, or in this case, maybe bringing it back together, than he is about tackling big picture issues about slavery. Now he's going to realize eventually he can take his beliefs about slavery and kind of force a reunification of the Union in a way. We got to consider here. Lincoln, as I've suggested, was morally opposed to slavery. He had taken political stances clearly against the expansion of slavery, So why was he so hesitant early on to make a bigger issue out of slavery? Why didn't he make that a kind of key point of his investment in the Civil War early on? Why did he make it more about preserving the Union? Well, one thing we got to consider is that there were these border states, which were states kind of in the upper South that had slavery but did not join the Confederacy. All right, they refused to leave the Union. And Lincoln knew that he had to keep these states on his side here. And if he acted too extreme in terms of saying, I'm going to end slavery outright, or I'm going to make efforts to tackle slavery, that he could very easily lose his support from these southern states here who had remained loyal to the Union, and they could easily jump ship and join the Confederacy. So to keep them on board, he was very gradual with the approach he took toward combating slavery. And he waited until he knew that he had them solidly in support of the Union to really start making slavery a bigger key issue of what his concerns were as the commander in chief of the U.S. during the Civil War. We can see that Lincoln did gradually make slavery a bigger issue throughout the war. So, for example, by 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So, this is a largely misunderstood proclamation. I'm sure most people have heard about it at some point, but I've heard all kinds of malarkey about this proclamation. I've heard some people say that this is what ended slavery and this is why there is no longer slavery in the US, which is not right. I've heard other people make arguments like, well, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free a single slave, which is a total load of bullshit. Excuse me. What this did do is recognize emancipation of all enslaved people in Confederate controlled territory, okay? Only in rebel controlled territory. It also allowed African Americans to join the U.S. military. So, this is a very strategic political move. This encouraged thousands of enslaved people in the South to leave their enslavers and to come join the Union Army. All right, so this was very crippling to the South, very beneficial to the U.S. military because now they're getting all these new forces. But this also managed to take on slavery very gradually in a way that didn't push away those border states. All right, so it's still allowing them to continue to practice slavery for now so that they don't jump ship and join the Confederacy. Very, very significant, this Emancipation Proclamation. This led to thousands of enslaved people leaving the South and joining the Union Army. Okay. So some people may argue that, oh, well, because this was in the Confederacy's land claims, that they had sovereignty over the land, so the enslaved people wouldn't be able to recognize their freedom. That's why you'll hear people say things like, it didn't actually free a single slave. But that just greatly undermines the agency and what records show us about the agency of enslaved people during the Civil War. All right, they were quite capable of learning about this proclamation, making sense of this proclamation, and responding very directly to it. And that's exactly what happened, okay? Thousands of enslaved people fled the South, freed themselves from bondage essentially, and came and joined with the U.S. military, offering their support in that regard, which in turn dealt a big blow to the South. Another place we can see Lincoln starting to gradually move beyond having simply preserving the Union as his goal in the Civil War and making it clear that slavery was also a key component of this was in part of a speech he gave known as the Gettysburg Address. This was a dedication to soldiers who had died at this very brutal battle in Gettysburg. And in his address here at Gettysburg, Lincoln spoke about a new birth of freedom. Now, why would there be a new birth of freedom? This is very revolutionary language. We're talking about a complete change. We're talking about something new. Who do you think it is he's talking about here who would be included in this new freedom who had been excluded from freedom before the Civil War? He's talking about enslaved people here. He's very clearly bringing about this issue of slavery, gradually again making it more and more of a key component of the Civil War. So, sure, preserving the Union is part of the Civil War here, but a key component of it does clearly seem to be, as it's gradually exposed throughout the war, also having to do with tackling slavery. So, Lincoln's views on slavery in the Civil War are pretty complicated, and that should certainly be understood and appreciated for what it is. And to help us better understand that, I'm going to play a clip here from a historian named Eric Foner, who's an excellent historian who specializes on studying the Civil War and Reconstruction period. Let's hear what he has to say about Lincoln and his views on slavery.
Lincoln didn't exist in a historical vacuum, obviously. He's part of a spectrum of thinking on slavery in that era. At one end of the spectrum are the people we know as abolitionists, the Frederick Douglass, the William Lloyd Garrisons, the Wendell Phillips. These were people who demanded the immediate abolition of slavery and the incorporation of blacks as equal members of American society. Now, their role was very important in abolishing slavery. They were not a very large number, but they helped to change the public discourse about slavery, which is critical. On the other end, of course, are people like John C. Calhoun and others who just thought slavery was the best kind of system and should be permanent. But even within the anti-slavery spectrum, you had these abolitionists on one end, and on the other end, you had people who wanted to get rid of slavery, but thought it would be a long, long process. Lincoln once said it would take 100 years to get rid of slavery. They couldn't really conceive of blacks being members of American society. They talked of gradual emancipation, of paying the owners for their slaves, and very often of colonizing them outside of the country. Lincoln starts out at that end of the spectrum, but during his life, and particularly in the Civil War, he moves toward the abolitionist position. By the end of the Civil War, he's obviously presiding over the immediate abolition of slavery with no compensation, no payment to slave owners, even though slaves legally are property. And at the very end of his life, he's talking for the first time publicly of giving the right to vote to at least some African Americans in the South. So that's a whole different picture than sending them out of the country. Now they're going to be there as part of the political system. So what's interesting to me about Lincoln is how he moves along that spectrum. Too many people take one moment in Lincoln's career or one letter or one speech and they say, there is Lincoln. But you can't pin him down at one spot. That's part of his greatness. He grows, he changes. In a period of radical change, he himself is able to rethink his ideas. And many presidents, including some recent ones, aren't able to rethink even when, events seem to suggest they may be on the wrong track.
All right, so suggesting that preserving the Union on its own was a key cause of the Civil War, or even that's Lincoln's motivation for the war, is quite a bit of an understatement. Slavery certainly was a key role as well, and that's certainly something that did become more prevalent throughout the war. Even if we are focusing on that goal of preserving the Union and seeing that as the key cause of the Civil War, why was it that the Union needed to be preserved in the first place? Where were these threats to the Union coming from? Well, they came from the fact that 11 southern states had left the Union. Why did they leave the Union? Well, they made that pretty clear for us. So if we look at secession as a key cause of the war, which it absolutely was, and we consider why the states seceded, we can see that the main reason they seceded was because they were afraid of losing slavery. How do we know that? They told us pretty straightforward. When all these states left the Union, they wrote documents called Ordinances of Secession. So these Ordinances of Secession were essentially their justifications for leaving the Union. In a way, they're breakup letters with the United States, we could think of them as. So we look at a couple examples here. In Mississippi's Ordinance for Secession, they state very plainly, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Louisiana states that the people of the slaveholding state are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery. And our great state of Texas stated that the African race had no agency in their establishment and that they were rightfully held as an inferior and dependent race. Very clearly, subjugation of African Americans in this condition of servitude, which they call their peculiar institution, is a key component for why all of these states are leaving the Union. All right, and all of these states, by the way, wrote these ordinances of secession. I'm just giving you a few examples here but all of them make it very plain that their reason for seceding is tied to slavery. Another justification for secession that has clear links to slavery is the Cornerstone Speech. So, the Cornerstone Speech was a speech given by the Vice President of the Confederacy, a guy named Alexander Stephens. And in this speech, Stephens argued that slavery was the cornerstone of the South. Cornerstone meaning the bedrock, the foundation. He stated in this speech, the new Constitution has put to rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists among the proper status of the Negro and our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. He is telling us here, word for word, along with these other states, that slavery was their key cause for seceding from the Union. Now, I do need to give a disclaimer right quick. I read this word out loud, and the first semester I did that. I didn't realize I need to explain to students that this is not the N word. Okay, this is a very different word than the N word. The N word, which we all know what I'm talking about, is a word that in its very nature is derogatory. It was invented to be a derogatory word. This word here is just a kind of antiquated phrase for people of African descent, all right? Negro is not a bad word. It's just a dated term that we don't really use anymore. And it's perfectly fine to use that word when you're studying the context of people using the word Negro. There's nothing wrong, nothing offensive about it, unless you're using it in a derogatory way. It is far different than the actual N word. So please don't go writing anonymous reviews at the end of the semester about how racist I am because I said the N word. Because no, I did not. That is not the N word. Moving on. Slavery and racially based slavery are clear elements of why the South has chosen to leave the Union. And that's the one kind of key component I keep seeing show up here, whether it's in the tariffs or if it's in preserving the Union or if it's in states' rights or it's in secession. All of these things lead back to slavery, right? That's the one kind of common thread linking them all together. So I think we can see that slavery does seem to be the key cause of the Civil War. All right, so that addresses one component of what I wanted to look at in this lecture. But another thing I want to consider is why Americans are wanting to fight in this war. As we're going to see in our next lecture, this is a very brutal war. This is the bloodiest war in U.S. history. All right. It is beyond devastating. There's families torn apart, killing each other, quite literally. We're talking disease, we're talking amputations, we're talking high death tolls. We'll see a little all that more moving forward. But why would people be willing to risk all of that? Well, I'm going to lay it out for you that a lot of them actually were not. Okay, there was a great deal of people who were drafted into this war. And a lot of individuals who were drafted into this war were not okay with that. We need to understand that there's mostly poor Americans who were being drafted and sent to fight in the war, whether it was in the North or in the South. In many cases, elites were able to buy their way out of military service, and that's true on both sides. And so it became a common saying throughout the nation, both in the Confederate States and in the Union States, that the Civil War was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, meaning they were fighting on behalf of these politicians and wealthy individuals who had their qualms with one another, and they were pitting the common poor people against one another to fight on their behalf. And that's pretty commonly become a way of understanding most wars moving forward, and it's pretty dang accurate. But in response to opposition of this war, there were a great deal of protests and even riots, okay? So we can look, for example, to a series of riots that broke out in New York City in response to protests against the Civil War draft. So these were intense riots in which thousands of rioters went and rampaged through New York City, looting, fighting police and federal troops. And by the end of all this, there were somewhere around 100 civilians killed and hundreds more injured. All right, and that's not to account also for the immense property destruction and injury and death caused to police as a part of all of this as well. This is a pretty clear demonstration, guys, there was notable resistance to the Civil War and especially to the draft. People love to blame these things on whatever generations going through them. During Vietnam, people acted like the counterculture, people resisting the war, were such unpatriotic people who were breaking tradition and precedents. In more recent conflicts within my lifetime in the Middle East, when people don't support those conflicts, they're looked at as some kind of traitors who have lost a sense of American identity. And this isn't something we do. And we support our troops no matter what. We support the war no matter what. Well, first off, guys, you can certainly support troops without supporting the war. You need to make that very crystal clear. But no, this is nothing new. There are people here protesting this war, protesting the draft, and protesting against the concept of fighting a poor man's fight on behalf of the rich, right? Way back here in the 1860s. There were, however, several individuals who did have some extreme motivations to fight in this war. And even some of those who were drafted into the war came to find these motivations to help them carry through. So most Union soldiers were fighting to preserve their way of life. Many of them were fighting for Union. A lot of them wanted to work on behalf of reuniting the nation. A lot of them came to fear that having the nation so divided could lead to the U.S. being susceptible to attack from foreign nations. So they really just wanted to fight as hard as possible to bring this to an end as quickly as possible. A lot of soldiers did believe also that they were fighting to preserve the ideals of the American Revolution. Okay, they're fighting on behalf of things like liberty and natural rights, especially as slavery became more of an issue throughout the war. Those issues became very prevalent. All right, early on, not a lot of Union soldiers, does it seem, according to sources we have, don't seem to have been too interested in slavery. But gradually, as the war progressed, more and more started to see that this was a key component of this war and started to recognize that as a fundamental piece to fighting on behalf of these American values like liberty and natural rights. Now, I would say I kind of push back this against this a little bit to suggest that early in the war, not many Union soldiers were on board with ending slavery. Because remember, one key goal they had was to reunite the nation, right? They're fighting for union. Well, why are they needing to reunite the nation? Why are they fighting for union? Because the nation's been divided, because these southern states have seceded. Why? Oh, yeah, slavery. But especially as slavery started to be recognized as a tool to weaken the South through things like the Emancipation Proclamation and other examples we'll look at moving forward. The Union Army used to provide assistance to enslaved people. As these things progressed, more and more Union soldiers started to be more invested in combating slavery as part of their motivation for fighting this war as well. Now, Confederate soldiers. We've certainly looked at the motivations of the Confederacy as a whole, as their state's leaders, the reasons they seceded from the Union, the reasons that they went to war. But that's not to say that those were the reasons that every individual who took up arms in the South was fighting, okay? So a lot of these individuals who were taking up arms were actually fighting for the same reasons as Union soldiers. They were fighting, again, to preserve their way of life. A lot of them believed that their homes and their families were in danger, okay? As Northern troops were coming down into the South, they're afraid of what that might mean for their families or for their homes. They had been led to believe in many cases that President Lincoln and the Union Army had led an invasion of the South and that they needed to fight back against that to defend their homes. They also, many of them, believed that they were fighting to preserve the ideals of the American Revolution. They're fighting this government, which they've been led to believe is tyrannical. Right? So there are some common motivations among North and South, it seems. Now, while their governments, their armies, even perhaps as a whole, stand for conflicting ideals, the individuals on the ground level have pretty similar reasons overall for fighting. And there were certainly some common viewpoints that seem to have been shared by soldiers in both armies pretty directly in terms of things like camaraderie between their troops. So these young men were witnessing all all kinds of horrors together, basically trauma bonding together, having to survive together, witnessing all kinds of things at a very young age that I hope most people never have to witness throughout their lifetimes. We also need to understand that a lot of these units in which they're fighting were organized by where people are from. So there'd be people from the same communities in some cases, if not, then from the same states, fighting alongside each other. And so they had that sense of community, that sense of camaraderie that we're here to back each other up. We understand each other. We have something in common that we need to help defend for each other. Another thing that was common throughout both the North and the South was this view of military service as an honorable act of manhood that a young man could use to kind of prove himself as a man. There was also a great deal of peer pressure, both in the North and in the South, to kind of push individuals to go get involved in this conflict. By this standard here, where people are kind of holding this as a symbol of honor and manhood, if a young man had brothers and cousins and friends who were out fighting in this war, and he refused to, he could start to be looked at as a coward or as an unhonorable man. Uh, and we like to think that maybe these are such old 19th century ideals, but a lot of this is still at play in a lot less direct ways than it was here, even in our present day. So the key point I want us to understand is sure there's the cause of the Civil War. There's what the government's pushing for on either side. There's the goals that the military has on either side. But the individuals, those fighting on the battlefield, have their own motivations as well. Okay, and it's very important for us to recognize that agency and recognize that they're not all necessarily just on board with exactly what their government's pushing for. And remember, on both sides, there's also drafts in which a lot of individuals here are kind of having to fight and find ways to cope with all of this and make sense of it all in a way that works for them. All right, last thing we're going to look at is the role of African Americans in the Civil War. We'll see that they were very active. So I'm going to argue that enslaved people have been engaged in a form of politics and resistance since long before the Civil War in very conscious and often collective ways, and that they would continue to do this even more so throughout the Civil War. And some of you are thinking, how were they politically engaged? They had no right to vote. Hell, in many cases, they didn't even have the right to do basic things like read and write. Well, we need to remember, guys, these are historical actors. And we also need to remember that I look at politics to a much broader scope than simply things like voting or holding office. Remember, I look at politics as collective struggles toward anything that could be deemed a socially meaningful form of power. And we certainly see collective efforts toward power carried out by enslaved people. So, for example, they had various networks of communication where they could send messages throughout plantations and between plantations, whether it was through things like song. They frequently used churches as meeting spaces. It was pretty common for enslaved people to have Sundays off. So holy, I know. But they would go and congregate at their churches and use their sermons as kind of secret codes to spread either messages to communicate with each other or to just provide each other with a symbol of hope that one day this would all end. They also sometimes used tapestries, things like quilts, basically as maps to show how they could secretly travel between plantations and carry out messages to each other. Another way enslaved people empowered one another was by forming fictive kinship networks. So we need to understand that as enslaved people were auctioned off throughout the nation, many of them were separated from their families. So they kind of just made kinship networks with whoever they lived with. And they used those close bonds to empower one another. I do need to understand as well that something I haven't really gotten into that is worth noting is the slave trade itself, meaning the importation of enslaved people from Africa had been banned in the early 1800s, yet there was tremendous growth of slavery throughout the 1800s, largely as a result of laws that had been inherited from colonial America. Things like, remember, the children of enslaved women would automatically be born enslaved. Well, that's the case still here in the United States as well. So as long as enslaved people were enslaved women, that is, were having children, there was a perpetually growing enslaved labor force. that did also, unfortunately, in many cases, as records show us, promote sexual assault by enslavers to continue to grow their enslaved labor force. Anyway, that may seem like a side note, but it's worth noting. Another way that enslaved people, though, would engage in a kind of political form of resistance to their conditions was through things like work shortages. So they would sometimes say, "Oh, silly me, I broke this tool. Guess I gotta wait till we can get a new one or till we can get it fixed before I can go do any more of this hard work." Shucks. Or they would fake being sick. Maybe they'd loosen up some screws or nails on a certain thing so that it would fall apart. And oh shucks, guess we gotta wait until we get this thing fixed before we can do any more hard work. And then in other cases, there would be direct revolts. Now, slave revolts were far less common than enslavers made them out to be. They were kind of this looming threat that people always feared. They weren't quite that common, but they certainly did happen. And as I suggested before, usually when these types of slave revolts would get a little momentum behind them, they'd be shut down pretty quickly, and those involved would be either killed on the spot or executed later down the road. But there was always kind of that idea that there could be some kind of slave revolt. Point I want us to understand is despite the fact that slavery was growing and there were all kinds of restrictions placed on the humanity in many cases of these enslaved people, they did have quite a bit of agency, and they found various ways to engage in an indirect form of politics, whether it's through kinship or communication or travel or various forms of slowing down or interrupting the system. And as the Civil War was breaking out, enslaved people began to develop their own understandings of the Civil War, and they'd communicate with each other about things that they'd overheard, or some of them illegally had learned a little reading and writing here and there. They would get a hold of newspapers and interpret what those newspapers were saying, and they started to have their own understanding of the Civil War, which inspired many of them to do what they could to participate in the Civil War indirectly. And this really motivated a lot of enslaved people to begin fighting for freedom. And an early place in which enslaved people were able to seek a form of refuge as well as make some contributions toward the Civil War were in what were known as contraband camps. So remember that enslaved people were legally considered property. Under a series of acts known as the Confiscation Acts, Union soldiers were given permission to confiscate any property that they seized from the Confederacy, and the Army was able to hold on to that property as wartime contraband. So they used this as a technicality to begin providing refuge to enslaved people in their Union Army camps. So they would help liberate enslaved people, bring them into the Union Army camps, and say these are now quote unquote contraband of war, and let them hang out there in the camp, where they'd be provided a sense of safety as well as food, shelter, etc. And many enslaved people willingly came to these contraband camps because it provided them a sense of protection. Furthermore, it gave them an opportunity to contribute to the war effort. They could come and help provide for the camps, whether it was through cleaning or cooking or whatever else it may be that the Union Army needed at these camps. So, in a sense, these contraband camps provided enslaved people early opportunities to start participating and actively supporting the war. Many of them also had opportunities to work for small wages here at these contraband camps. So again, we're seeing them getting involved in the war even as slavery is continuing to exist. So the reason we know about these contraband camps is thanks to a lady named Susie Baker King Taylor, who provided firsthand accounts of the contraband camps. She was also one of the first African American nurses during the Civil War, helped provide medical care to individuals in the U.S. Army. And she also took on the essential role of founding schools to help educate formerly enslaved African Americans. Very active lady, a clear example of political participation of African Americans throughout the Civil War. Another example we can see of African Americans participating and contributing to the Civil War was with someone like Harriet Tubman. Remember, Harriet Tubman had been leading that network of helping enslaved people escape their conditions of servitude. And throughout the Civil War, she certainly helped a lot of people escape to these contraband camps to seek refuge with the Union Army. She also helped lead one military operation that helped free somewhere around 750 men, women, children, and babies. She also acted as a spy for the Union Army, Point I'm getting at is Harriet Tubman in various ways was both directly and indirectly involved in providing support for the Union Army during the Civil War. So she's a clear example of, or perhaps even a demonstration of, the direct and indirect military support provided by African Americans during the Civil War. Then also, of course, under the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were welcomed into the army, and those who were whose freedom was being recognized from the South were kind of encouraged in that sense to come and join the army, and thousands of them did. All right, so somewhere around 180,000 black soldiers came and joined the Union Army. They were in segregated units, but they're coming and joining in substantial numbers. All right, they made up nearly 10% of the Union Army. So the Civil War, in a sense, is allowing African Americans to get more engaged in politics in the U.S. than they ever had been collectively been able to before. But with the Civil War, they're now getting more direct opportunities to start fighting for freedom. And it was also largely African Americans' contribution to the war and their service in the war that convinced President Lincoln and others that African Americans could and should be considered as potential citizens of the United States. As a result of the Civil War, African Americans and all men of all races born in the United States, for that matter, would wind up gaining citizenship, but that would not be immediate. That would require the process of Reconstruction, which is a concept you'll be grappling with in History 1302. What we do see, though, is African Americans being very directly involved in their own freedom struggle here. And that's something I certainly want to stress. All right, guys, we've covered a lot here today. We've looked at causes of the Civil War, we've looked at motivations for individuals directly involved, and we've looked at the very key roles played by African Americans in the Civil War. This gives us a pretty good starting point. We'll move forward from here, looking at some more revolutionary aspects of the war, as well as why this was the bloodiest war in American history. If y'all have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, this is it for now. Over and out.